The decision was made in the sterile silence between the doctor's reassuring words and his wife's first crocodile tear. Dr. Matthews, a man whose exhaustion was etched into the lines around his kind eyes, had just finished his litany of good news. A severe concussion, deep tissue bruising, a world-class headache, but the scans were clear. No spinal fractures, no cerebral bleeding. "You're a very lucky man, Mr. Earl," he'd concluded, clicking off his penlight with a sound that seemed to finalize the diagnosis. "You'll be sore, but you're going to make a full recovery." The words hung in the air, a clean clinical promise. Arthur Earl, a man who had built an empire on the certainty of physics and the integrity of steel, clung to them. He had survived. The twisted metal of his Mercedes S-Class, accordioned against a concrete overpass support with the violence of a collapsing star, had not been his tomb. He remembered the screech of tires, a sound that seemed to tear the fabric of the afternoon, the sickening lurch as gravity lost its familiar grip, and then a concussive roar that was not so much heard as felt, a force that sought to unmake him. And then, silence. Now, this new silence in the hospital room felt just as profound, a vacuum waiting to be filled. Then Monica had swept in, a maelstrom of Chanel No. 5 and manufactured panic. Her face, a perfect oval of porcelain skin he had once considered the pinnacle of earthly beauty, was artfully crumpled into a mask of frantic concern. She clutched his hand, her own trembling with a practiced tremor he had never noticed before, a subtle vibrato of insincerity that his newly sharpened senses registered with alarming clarity. "Oh, Earl, my love," she'd breathed, her voice a husky whisper that had once sent shivers of pleasure down his spine. Now, it just sounded thin, brittle, like a veneer stretched too taut over something ugly. "I was so scared. I thought I'd lost you." Her tears, hot and real, landed on the back of his hand. He analyzed their temperature, their saline content, as if they were a chemical compound he needed to identify. They were real tears, yes, but he understood with a sudden, chilling insight that one can cry from the effort of a performance just as easily as from genuine grief. Her eyes, those brilliant forget-me-not blue eyes, were a fraction too wide, a shade too bright. They weren't reflecting terror. They were projecting it, a performance for an audience of one, broadcast with the desperate intensity of a failing actress in her final audition. He looked at her, truly looked at her, perhaps for the first time in years, and the small gnawing doubts he had been so diligently burying for the past year erupted with the force of the car crash itself. He had been burying them under layers of expensive gifts, luxurious vacations, and the willful blindness of a man terrified to admit his masterpiece of a life had a fatal flaw. A memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. 6 months ago, at a charity gala for the city orchestra. He'd seen her across the ballroom, talking to Julian Abernathy, a smarmy banking rival whose handshake was always damp. Her laugh wasn't her usual tinkling social chime, the one she deployed to charm investors and soothe egos. It was throaty, intimate, a sound he hadn't heard directed at him in a long time, a sound that belonged to the bedroom, to whispered secrets in the dark. It was a laugh of genuine, unguarded delight. When he had approached, her expression had shifted in a blink, the warmth vanishing, replaced by a polite, wifely smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Darling, you know Mr. Abernathy," she had said, her voice smooth as cream, and the moment was gone. But the image of her unguarded expression remained, a splinter in his mind, festering just below the surface. Now that splinter festered. The thousands of dollars that vanished from the household account for a spa weekend that left her with no visible tan, and a story about mud baths and seaweed wraps that sounded rehearsed. The tens of thousands for a shopping trip to Milan, from which she returned with only 2 new pairs of shoes and a vague complaint about the exchange rate. The $50,000 withdrawal she had explained away with a dazzling smile and a convoluted story about a friend's emergency business loan. A friend he'd never met, whose name changed twice in the telling. He was a wealthy man, a man who had built a construction empire from blueprints and bedrock. He understood cost-benefit analysis. He had always told himself it was the cost of happiness, the price of keeping a woman 30 years his junior vibrant and content. A beautiful object requires maintenance. He had chosen to trust, to believe in the beautiful life he had so carefully constructed, beam by beam. It was easier than admitting the blueprints might be flawed, that the foundation he had poured was compromised from the very beginning. Now, lying in the hospital bed, with the smell of antiseptic burning his nostrils, and the low rhythmic beep of the heart monitor measuring out his life in steady, electronic pulses, he felt the foundations of that life groan. He, the master builder, could sense a catastrophic structural failure. He knew the sounds of stress, the subtle vibrations that preceded collapse. He had spent a lifetime listening for them in steel and concrete. Now he heard them in his own life. The doctor said his body was sound, but his life was not. The crash hadn't caused this. It had merely illuminated the cracks that were already there, tracing them in blinding, undeniable light. And in that cold, clinical moment, with the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor as his witness, Arthur Earle, a man of action, chose absolute inaction. It was a terrible, magnificent, and terrifying decision. He would not move. He would not speak. He would become a block of stone, a piece of furniture in his own home. He would feign a waking coma, a total paralysis born of psychological trauma, and he would wait. He would become a ghost in his own machine and see what truths would crawl out into the silence. It was an engineer's solution. When you suspect a critical flaw, you don't patch it over. You stop all operations. You observe. You gather data, and you wait for the weakness to reveal itself under stress. He closed his eyes, letting his breath even out into a shallow, unconscious rhythm he copied from a documentary he'd once seen on deep-sea divers. When the nurse came in moments later, a cheerful woman with a kind but distracted air, he let his eyelids flutter open to reveal nothing. The keen analytical light within them was gone, extinguished. He had retreated deep into the fortress of his own skull, leaving only a vacant, unfocused stare he fixed on a faint water stain on the acoustic ceiling tile. He analyzed its shape, a pale archipelago on a sea of white fiberboard. He would come to know this stain intimately. He had set the trap, baiting it with his own living body. Now, he only had to wait for the quarry to wander in. The week in the hospital was a crucible of self-control, an exercise in endurance that dwarfed any physical challenge he had ever faced. He became an object, a 190-pound puzzle of dead weight for the nurses and orderlies. He endured the prodding and turning to prevent bed sores, the indignity of being sponged down by strangers who chatted about their weekends over his inert form, the slow trickle of nutrients from an IV bag that left a metallic taste in his mouth. His mind, however, was a fortress of screaming resolve. Every muscle fiber ached with the strain of remaining perfectly limp, of consciously overriding the body's millions of years of instinct to react, to shift, to recoil. Every nerve ending fired with the desire to flinch from a cold stethoscope, to scratch an itch, to simply shift his weight from a pressure point that was becoming agonizing. The most exquisite torture was an itch that developed on the sole of his left foot, a maddening, persistent prickle in the arch that he couldn't reach. It was a tiny, insignificant torment that threatened to drive him insane. He spent hours mentally deconstructing the problem, imagining complex robotic arms and pulley systems to scratch it, a futile exercise in engineering that kept him from screaming aloud. He channeled his focus, turning his body into a pure problem of physics. He calculated the force required for a nurse to roll him, the cantilever effect of his arm dangling off the bed, the tensile strength of his own willpower. He was an engineer, and this was the ultimate stress test. He would not break. Monica was a constant, suffocating presence. Her performance was flawless, an Oscar-worthy portrayal of the distraught, devoted wife. She was always there when the doctors made their rounds, her brow furrowed with concern, a notepad in hand to jot down their pronouncements. She read him poetry, Keats and Shelley, her voice a melodic drone that grated on his raw nerves. He hated poetry. He was a man of concrete facts and measurable forces. She knew he hated poetry. He'd once told her it was like trying to build a bridge out of smoke. It was a performance for the nurses, not for him. She played his favorite symphonies on her phone, music that had once filled him with soaring joy, now serving as the soundtrack to his private hell. Mahler's Fifth, which they had heard together in Vienna on their honeymoon, a trip that now seemed like a scene from another man's life, sounded like a funeral dirge for his own. She would hold his limp hand, her touch no longer a comfort, but the dry, feathery crawl of a spider. He could feel the cold, hard diamond of her 4-carat wedding ring press against his knuckles, a constant, mocking reminder of the vows she had so clearly, so contemptuously broken. The doctors are calling it conversion disorder, she explained to a visitor on the phone, her voice thick with manufactured tears as she stood by his bedside, silhouetted against the gray light of the window. He recognized the voice on the other end of her hushed conversation as her mother's, a woman who had always looked at him with a mixture of awe at his wealth and disdain for his age. A psychological break from the trauma. They say there's no physical reason for it. He's just retreated. But I know you're in there, my love, she'd murmur, leaning close to his ear after hanging up. I'll wait for you. I'll be right here, always. The lie was so smooth, so practiced. It was almost beautiful in its ugliness. She was an artist, and her medium was deceit. He wondered how many other lies she had crafted with such care, how many other performances she had given. One evening, she thought he was asleep, or as asleep as a vegetable could be. He had mastered the art of letting his eyes remain open, but unfocused, the muscles of his face so relaxed he appeared utterly vacant. He heard the whisper click of her compact opening, the soft brush of powder on her cheeks. She was touching up her makeup. Why? He wondered. For him? For the night nurse? Then a new scent intruded, not her usual Chanel, but something warmer, more floral, a perfume he didn't recognize. She was preparing for a visitor. She leaned close, her breath warm and scented with the crisp apple notes of Pinot Grigio against his ear. Are you enjoying the show, you old fool? She whispered, so softly it was barely audible, a venomous little secret shared between the tormentor and her victim. I hope you're in there. I really do. I want you to know what it feels like to be completely, utterly helpless. The sheer naked malice of it was a physical shock, more jarring than the crash itself. His heart monitor, his silent betrayer, skipped a beat, then another, a frantic stutter in the steady rhythm. He saw the green line on the screen jump erratically. He wrestled it back under control with a surge of pure will, forcing his heart rate to slow, his breathing to deepen, imagining a pendulum swinging slow and steady. She laughed, a tiny silent puff of air, and walked away, her hips swaying with a confidence that infuriated him. The trap was no longer just for her. It was now his only defense. His paralysis was no longer a strategy. It was a shield. He was discharged into her care. The journey home in the back of a specialized medical transport van was surreal. He watched the familiar streets of his neighborhood slide by the window, a world he could see but no longer interact with. The oak trees he'd passed every day for years, now blazing with autumn color, seemed like props on a stage set. His house, a sprawling testament to his success built of granite and glass and cantilevered steel, looked alien, like a photograph of a place he once knew. He had personally overseen every inch of its construction, arguing with architects over sightlines and with contractors over the specific grain of the cedar planks for the ceilings. He had designed it to be a fortress of solitude and peace, a cathedral to his achievements. It was no longer his sanctuary. It was the stage for the final act of a tragedy. He was being delivered to his own prison. Monica, with the help of a burly, soft-spoken private nurse named George, settled him into the master bedroom, into their bed, the California king he had bought for them, the bed where he had slept and dreamed and loved for 5 years. It felt like a sarcophagus. George was a large man, gentle in his movements, with the simple, trusting face of a farmer. He handled Earl's inert form with a practiced professionalism that was both reassuring and deeply humiliating. He was an expert in the geography of helplessness, knowing just where to support a limb, how to shift weight without causing strain. "I'll take the first night shift, George," Monica said, her voice efficient and smooth as polished marble, the perfect imitation of a competent, caring spouse taking charge. "You can get some rest in the guest wing. I want to be with him." George, wiping his hands on his scrubs, nodded, his expression one of open admiration. "He's a lucky man to have a wife like you, Mrs. Earl. I've seen a lot of families in these situations. It takes a toll. You're one of the strong ones." "I'm the lucky one," she replied, the lie so sweet it was acidic. She touched Arthur's cheek, her fingers cool. "He's my whole world." The house fell into a deep silence, punctuated only by the distant hum of the Sub-Zero refrigerator and the whisper of the climate control system he had designed himself for its acoustic subtlety. Earl lay on his back, his eyes fixed on the vaulted cedar ceiling, tracing the patterns of the wood grain he had chosen himself. He remembered the day he and the foreman had selected these very planks, arguing over the beauty of a particular knot, the richness of its color. He had won the argument. Now, the knot looked like a malevolent eye staring down at him. He practiced the art of the vacant stare, of letting his eyes see without focusing, of being a camera that only recorded, never processing. He was a watcher on the wall of his own life. At 10:17, he heard the soft chime of the front door, his internal clock, honed by decades of pre-dawn site visits and punishing schedules, was unerring. The footsteps that followed were not George's heavy, shuffling tread. They were light, confident, almost arrogant, the sound of expensive leather on marble as they crossed the floor of the foyer and ascended the grand curving staircase he had designed to resemble a nautilus shell. The sound was an intrusion, a violation of the house's sacred quiet. He heard Monica's voice, a low, throaty murmur he hadn't heard in weeks, not since the night of the gala. It was a sound of welcome, of intimacy, a sound reserved for a lover. Then came a soft laugh, a sound utterly different from the tinkling public chime she used for him. This was richer, darker, a genuine sound of pleasure that made the bile rise in his throat. The bedroom door swung open. Monica entered, and for a moment, she was just a silhouette against the hall light, a dark shape in his field of vision. Then she stepped aside, and a man followed her in. He was tall, with the lean, sculpted musculature of someone who spent their days admiring themselves in a gym mirror. He had smug, predatory good looks and a jawline that seemed perpetually clenched in self-satisfaction. Earl recognized him instantly. Leo Wallace, her personal trainer, whose exorbitant fees had been one of the first red flags on the credit card statements, an expense he had foolishly dismissed as another of her vanities. He was wearing a ridiculously tight V-neck shirt that showcased a chest that was offensively hairless, and jeans that cost more than Earl's first car. "Is he, out?" Leo asked, his voice a conspiratorial whisper that carried across the cavernous room with perfect clarity. Completely, Monica said. The casual cruelty in her tone was a physical blow. It was as if a switch had been flipped. The loving wife persona discarded like a costume at the end of a play. A vegetable. A very, very rich vegetable. They moved further into the room, their shadows dancing on the walls like monstrous puppets. Earl's heart began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the cage of his chest. He could feel the blood pounding in his temples, a pressure building behind his eyes. Stay calm. Stay empty. You are stone. You are concrete. Let the data come in. Observe. Record. The mantra spun in his head, a desperate prayer for control. He focused on the knot in the ceiling, the dark eye, and poured all his rage into it. Then came the ultimate violation, an act of such breathtaking audacity it almost shattered his resolve. The mattress dipped beside him, first on Monica's side, the familiar weight and scent of her, now tainted and foreign. Then, a second dip, on his side. Leo sat on the edge of his bed. Their backs were to him. They were using his deathbed as a sofa. He could feel the vibrations of their bodies through the springs, the heat radiating from their legs just inches from his own. It was a profound desecration of a space that had been intimate, private, his. He could smell Leo's cloying, spicy cologne, a cheap and vulgar scent that mingled with Monica's jasmine perfume, creating a nauseating miasma of betrayal. God, this is creepy, Leo said, his voice no longer a whisper. He was comfortable now, settling in. His eyes are open. Don't worry, Monica scoffed, the sound sharp and dismissive. There's nothing in there. The lights are on, but nobody's home. Trust me. I've been staring into those blank eyes for a week solid. It's like looking at a doll. She let out a short, ugly laugh. Poor old bastard. He was always so proud of his mind, his engineer's brain, always calculating, always planning. Look at him now, a broken machine. The rage that surged through Earl was a white-hot nova, threatening to incinerate his carefully constructed paralysis. He imagined the feeling of his hands, the hands that had drafted 1,000 blueprints and shaken on billion-dollar deals, wrapping around their throats. He imagined the satisfying snap of bone, the sudden, final silence. The fantasy was so vivid he could almost feel the strain in his forearms, but he held. He was a builder. Demolition had to be precise. You had to map the entire structure, identify all the load-bearing lies before you could bring the whole rotten thing down. Impulsive destruction was for amateurs. This required patience. This required a plan. Leo shifted his weight, his thigh brushing against Earl's hip. The contact was an electric shock of revulsion. It was a desecration. He draped a casual arm around Monica's shoulders, pulling her closer. Still, we should be careful. What if he has, a moment of clarity or something? Hears us? He won't, she said with chilling certainty. And even if he did, what could he do? Wiggle a toe, blink aggressively at us. It's perfect, Leo. It's absolutely perfect. We have him right where we want him. Passive, silent, and rich. My 3 favorite qualities in a husband. They fell silent for a moment, basking in the sheer arrogance of their position. The masters of a kingdom whose king was their prisoner. Earl focused on his breathing, forcing it into the shallow, even rhythm of a man lost to the world. A man whose mind was a placid, empty lake. Inside, a hurricane raged, leveling everything he had ever believed to be true. Then Leo asked the question, the simple, 6-word question that took the foundations of Earl's world and turned them to dust. Does he know about the boy? The silence that followed was different. It was heavier, colder, charged with a new kind of malice. A dread so profound it felt like ice water, flooding his veins settled in Earl's chest, heavy and suffocating. The boy, Junior, Arthur Jr., what about the boy? His mind, which had been a fortress of cold rage, suddenly felt fragile, like glass about to shatter. His son, his pride, the only thing that truly mattered. Monica laughed. It wasn't the tinkling chime of his wife or the throaty murmur of a lover. It was a high, brittle, cruel sound that scraped against the inside of his skull. It was the sound of a vulture cracking open a bone to get at the marrow. Of course not, she said, her words as sharp and glittering as shards of broken glass. He thinks Junior is his. He's so pathetic, Leo. He was sterile, had mumps as a boy, fried everything. Doctor told him when he was 20. He never told a soul. Too proud, too ashamed. But he wanted a legacy so badly, an heir to his precious construction empire. He was so grateful when I told him I was pregnant. So pathetically, blindly grateful he never even questioned it. The vaulted ceiling above him began to spin. The wood grain swirled into a vortex, pulling him down into a blackness deeper than any coma. Sterile. Not his. Not my son. The words were jackhammers, breaking him apart from the inside out. A memory, unbidden and agonizing, flashed behind his eyes. The garage, smelling of sawdust and sunshine. Junior, 17, and all awkward elbows and boundless energy, holding a hand plane, struggling with a piece of stubborn oak. Earl's large, calloused hand covering the boy's. Let the tool do the work, son. Feel the grain. You can't force it. You have to understand it. Respect the material. The memory, once a perfect jewel of fatherhood, now curdled into a grotesque mockery. The word son echoed in his mind. A taunt, a curse. Every proud moment, watching him score the winning goal in a soccer match. The shared look of understanding across a dinner table. The overwhelming pride at his high school graduation. All of it, a lie he had eagerly participated in. He had built his life around a son who was not his son. The central pillar of his entire existence was a fraud. That old fool, Monica continued, her voice laced with a venomous glee that was almost gleeful, reveling in her own cleverness. Paid for our son's entire college tuition up front. $250,000 wired to Yale. He thinks Junior is studying structural engineering, following in his brilliant footsteps. She laughed again, the sound wet and ugly. The idiot is studying art history. While you and I were in Tuscany last spring, staying in that villa he paid for, spending his money and laughing about it, Junior was buying a $1,000 textbook on Renaissance sculpture. Leo chuckled, a low guttural sound of shared conquest. Our son. I like the sound of that. He's got your brains, thank God, not this old fossils. He's got my ambition, Monica corrected, a silken threat in her tone. And he knows the plan. Junior is completely on board. He knows this is his only path to the inheritance. He cried a little when I told him about the accident, but he got over it when I reminded him what a new Porsche 911 looks like. Once I get power of attorney signed, we start liquidating. We'll sell the company to that vulture Petrocelli. Can you imagine? He'll finally get his hands on Earl's empire. We'll set up a small trust for the old man's nursing care. We're not monsters after all. And we'll be gone. A new life in Monaco or Dubai. The life we deserve. Earl lay there, a statue carved from ice and fury. The heartbreak was a physical agony, a crushing weight on his chest far heavier and more real than the two bodies perched on his bed. This wasn't just a betrayal by a cheating wife. This was a conspiracy. A long con played by the woman he loved, her lover, and the boy he had raised and cherished as his own son. His entire life, The one he thought he had built with such precision and care was a lie, a hollow facade built on a foundation of contempt. He wasn't the master builder. He was the mark. The love in his heart didn't just die. It was methodically, brutally murdered. It was dissected on a cold slab of truth, and he was forced to watch. And in the cold, empty space it left behind, something else began to grow. Something hard and patient and infinitely more dangerous. It was the mind of an engineer, the mind they had so casually mocked. A mind that saw not a shattered life, but a complex demolition project. The structural weaknesses had all been exposed. He had the complete, unvarnished truth, the blueprint of their deceit. Now, all he had to do was wait for the perfect moment to plant the charges and push the plunger. His birthday, next week, the day she planned to have him sign over his empire. It would not be a signing. It would be a detonation. The 8 days that followed were the longest of Arthur Earle's life. They were a masterclass in the architecture of hatred, a descent into a bespoke hell where absolute physical helplessness was paired with a mind burning with incandescent rage and meticulous, cold-blooded planning. He was a ghost in his own life, a silent, unblinking witness to the methodical dismantling of his world. He compartmentalized his grief, locking it away in a lead-lined box in the back of his mind. Pain was a luxury. Vengeance was a necessity. Monica was a whirlwind of predatory activity. She was constantly on the phone, her voice a smooth professional purr as she spoke to lawyers, accountants, and wealth managers, laying the groundwork for her coup. Standing by the panoramic window of his bedroom, looking out over the manicured lawns he had designed himself, she would speak in hushed, mournful tones. "Yes, Mr. Albright, it's an unspeakable tragedy," she'd say into her phone, twisting a strand of her hair around her finger. His mind is just gone. A blank slate. We need to protect his assets, of course, for his own good. Consolidate everything under a single administrative umbrella. Simplicity and security. That's what Earl would have wanted. Earl listened, his mind a steel trap, cataloging every lie, every smug, self-satisfied inflection. He learned the names of the lawyers she had hired. A piranha named Krendler, from a firm known for its aggressive, scorched earth tactics in estate battles. He learned that her plan to sell his construction company to his arch rival, Marco Petrocelli, was already in motion. She wasn't just stealing his money. She was erasing his legacy, handing the keys to the kingdom he had built from nothing to the one man he despised above all others. Petrocelli was a hack, a man who cut corners on safety and materials, who had once tried to bribe one of Earl's city inspectors. The thought of Petrocelli sitting in his chair, his cheap loafers propped up on the mahogany desk Earl had built with his own hands, running his company into the ground, was a special kind of poison. Leo was a frequent unwelcome visitor, though he never appeared when the day Nurse George was on duty. He and Monica treated the house as their personal resort. They drank Earl's Pappy Van Winkle 23-year-old in his study, their raucous laughter echoing up the grand staircase. Earl, a man who appreciated the subtle complexities of a fine bourbon, could only imagine them gulping it down like cheap whiskey. He could smell the expensive cigar smoke wafting into his room, a scent he loathed. They would wander into the bedroom sometimes, a morbid form of tourism, to gaze upon the fallen king. "Still staring, champ?" Leo would ask, snapping his fingers an inch from Earl's unblinking eyes. "Hello? Knock, knock. Anybody home in the Bone Dome?" Monica would laugh, a sound like grinding glass. "Leave him alone, darling. He's our golden goose. We don't want to bruise the fruit before we get it to market." But the deepest agony, the cut that went straight to the bone, was Junior. The boy, the young man, came home from Yale for the weekend, a trip ostensibly arranged so he could see his ailing father. He stood at the foot of the massive bed, his face a carefully composed mask of youthful sorrow. He was wearing a new, ridiculously expensive-looking watch, a Panerai with a thick leather strap that Earl had never seen before. A fresh token from his mother, no doubt. "Hey, Dad," he said, his voice quiet, almost cracking. "I came as soon as I heard. I'm so sorry this happened." Earl looked at the young man he had loved with a fierce, protective pride. He had taught him how to read a blueprint, how to frame a wall, how to shake a man's hand and look him in the eye. Now, he saw the lie swimming in those clear blue eyes, the same genetic lie he saw in his mother's. He saw the guilt warring with the greed. The boy couldn't quite meet his gaze, his eyes darting around the opulent room, landing on the paintings, the furniture, anywhere but on the vacant stare of the man he had called father his entire life. "Mom says you're not really there anymore," Junior stammered, twisting the hem of his expensive cashmere sweater. "She's being so strong, Dad. She's taking care of everything for you. She says you would have wanted her to. Our son. He's got my ambition." Monica's words echoed in the silent cavern of Earl's mind. A fresh wave of grief, so powerful it almost made him gasp for air, washed over him. This was the true betrayal. The loss of Monica was the loss of his present, a bitter but survivable amputation. The loss of Junior was the loss of his future, the death of a legacy he thought was his own flesh and blood made manifest. For a terrifying moment, his control wavered. A tear welled in the corner of his right eye, a hot traitorous drop of moisture. He willed it back, focusing all his energy on the tear duct, commanding it to retreat, to be reabsorbed. It was a small, desperate battle won in the war for his sanity, but grief was a luxury he could not afford. His mind was a blueprint, and he was adding details, calculating loads, planning every step of the demolition. The first problem was communication. He was a prisoner in his own body, a king in a dungeon of his own flesh. He needed an agent in the outside world, a loyal hand to execute his will. He needed David Chin. David had started as a site foreman for Earl 35 years ago, a hungry kid with a sharp mind and an unimpeachable work ethic. Now he was the chief operating officer of Earl's empire. And more than that, he was the only man on earth Earl trusted without reservation. They had a system, an old half-forgotten joke from their early days on hazardous high-rise construction sites. A specific sequence of blinks, designed for situations where shouting was impossible over the noise of machinery. One long, two short, distress, need immediate extraction, a silent alarm they hadn't used in decades, conceived one drunken night over beers after a near miss with a falling girder. It was a relic of a more dangerous time, now resurrected for a new kind of danger. He found his opportunity with George, the night nurse. George was methodical, his routine as predictable as the tides. Every 4 hours he would come in, check Earl's vitals, and perform a series of neurological checks. One of them involved shining a penlight into each of Earl's eyes to check his pupillary response. George was more observant than Monica gave him credit for. Earl had seen him watching her, a flicker of professional disapproval in his eyes, when she would take a business call in the room, her voice sharp and cold. George knew grief, and this, he seemed to sense, was not it. The next time George leaned over him, the smell of coffee on his breath. Earl waited for the bright, invasive beam to hit his left eye. He fought every biological instinct for his pupil to contract. With a monumental effort of will that sent a tremor through his entire body, he forced his eyelid to close for a full, deliberate second, then open. Then 2 quick, sharp blinks. One long, 2 short. George paused, his brow furrowing. He moved the light away, looking at Earl's face. That's odd. A blepharospasm, I guess. He was talking to himself, making a note on his chart. He seemed about to dismiss it, but a flicker of doubt crossed his face. He moved the light to the other eye. Earl did it again, focusing all his remaining energy into the tiny muscles of his eyelid. One long, two short. George straightened up, a look of genuine confusion on his simple, honest face. He had been a combat medic in Afghanistan. He knew things that weren't in the textbooks. He knew the difference between a random twitch and a signal. His professional gaze became something sharper, more analytical. He looked from Earl's vacant stare to the heart monitor, noting the steady rhythm, then back to his eyes. He glanced toward the closed bedroom door, a silent acknowledgement of the enemy territory they were in. He leaned in close, ostensibly to adjust Earl's pillow. "Mr. Earl," he whispered, his voice barely a breath against his ear. "If you can hear me, do it again when I check your pulse." A minute later, George took his wrist. Earl felt the nurse's 2 fingers press against his radial artery. He waited 3 seconds, then repeated the blink sequence against the man's thumb, which was resting on his eyelid. One long, two short. George's grip tightened for a fraction of a second. A silent confirmation. He said nothing more. He completed his checks, his movements now more deliberate, and left the room. An hour later, George returned, ostensibly for a routine check. He accidentally left his personal cell phone on the bedside table. "Darn it," he muttered to himself. "Keep forgetting my head if it wasn't attached." He left the room again. 2 hours later, at 3 a.m., Earl's personal cell phone, which Monica had left charging on his bedside table as a sentimental prop, began to buzz. Not a ringtone, just a persistent low vibration against the wood. It was a text. Then another, and another. A relentless, unignorable summons programmed by George, who had called David and explained the situation in clipped professional tones. Monica, sleeping in the adjoining guest suite, eventually stirred. She came into the room, a silk robe thrown over her shoulders, her face clouded with irritation. "What is that noise?" she muttered, then saw the vibrating phone. She picked it up. "Oh, for God's sake, it's David Chen," she said with a dismissive sigh. "What could he possibly want at this hour? Doesn't he ever sleep?" She let it buzz a few more times. Then, with an exasperated huff, she answered it, her voice instantly transforming into the smooth, concerned wife. "David, hello?" "Yes, it's a terrible time." "No, I'm afraid there's no change at all. He's resting peacefully." Earl couldn't hear David's side of the conversation, but he could imagine it. David was a bulldog. He would not be put off by platitudes or deflections. Monica's tone sharpened. "What do you mean you need to see him in person?" "The doctors have been very clear. He needs absolute rest and zero stimulation." "No, that's not possible." "David, I am his wife. I will not have you or the board second-guessing my decisions about his care." There was a long pause. Earl watched as the color drained from Monica's face. That's absurd. He can't have invoked that. It requires his explicit verbal consent or a certified medical incapacitation from a company physician. It's in the bylaws, Section 4, Paragraph C. You're quoting bylaws to me at 3 a.m. Fine. Bring your doctor. Come over in the morning. But you'll see for yourself. You're wasting everyone's time. She slammed the phone down onto its cradle, her hands shaking with a rage that was anything but feigned. "That bastard!" she hissed at the silent man in the bed. "He's invoking the keyman clause. Some ridiculous corporate contingency plan you two cooked up years ago, after that mess with the union. Says unless a company-appointed physician verifies your condition, the board can seize control of all voting shares to protect the company. Your paranoia is even working against me from beyond the grave, you old goat." A sliver of grim satisfaction pierced through Earl's rage. The first charge was armed. George had understood. David was coming. The next morning, David Chen was in the room. He was a compact, impeccably dressed man in his late 50s. His face a calm, unreadable mask that concealed a brilliant, tactical mind. He was followed by a stern-looking woman in a severe business suit, a Dr. Earl didn't recognize. "Monica," David said, his voice level and devoid of emotion. "This is Dr. Albright. She is here to make a private assessment as stipulated in the corporate bylaws." "This is an outrageous invasion of my husband's privacy," Monica protested, physically trying to block their path to the bed, her body a barrier of righteous indignation. "It is a fulfillment of his own directive to protect his life's work," David countered, his eyes as cold as chips of flint. He didn't raise his voice, but there was an immovable quality to him. He stepped around her as if she were a piece of furniture and stood by Earl's bed. He looked down at his old friend, his face betraying nothing. Dr. Albright began her examination, checking reflexes, responses, shining her own penlight into Earl's eyes. Monica hovered nearby, radiating a palpable aura of fury. When the doctor leaned in with her light, David positioned himself just behind her, in Earl's direct line of sight. Earl looked past the blinding light, directly at David's tie clip, a simple silver bar. One long, two short. David's expression didn't flicker by a single muscle, but Earl saw it. A subtle, almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes. He understood. The signal was confirmed. The channel was open. Dr. Albright finished her examination. "He's completely unresponsive," she announced, her tone flat and clinical. "Vitals are stable, but there are no discernible cognitive responses to any stimuli. The hospital's diagnosis of severe conversion disorder appears to be accurate." "Thank you, doctor," David said, turning to Monica. "It seems you were correct. I apologize for the intrusion." It was a perfect performance of defeat. The triumphant, smug smile that spread across Monica's face was almost more than Earl could bear. She had won. She had fooled them all. But as David turned to leave, he feigned a clumsy stumble, brushing against the heavy bedside table. A small black object, no bigger than a sugar cube, fell from the cuff of his suit sleeve. It landed silently on the plush, dark blue carpet and rolled under the heavy floor-length valance of the bed. A high-fidelity, long-duration audio recorder, voice-activated and with a battery life of over a month. The second charge was set. Now, the real work could begin. Over the next few days, David became his hands and feet in the world. Earl knew his friend would have retrieved the recorder, likely using a second, more plausible excuse to visit. He had returned the next day under the guise of dropping off some corporate papers for Monica to review, creating a diversion by accidentally spilling a bottle of water in the hallway, drawing Monica and the nurse out of the room for a few crucial minutes. He would have heard it all by now. The mockery, the betrayal, the truth about Leo, the devastating truth about Junior. The anger and disgust David must have felt would now be channeled into cold, precise action. The evidence of his progress came in the form of Monica's increasingly frantic and enraged phone calls to Leo. "Can you believe this?" she shrieked into her phone one afternoon, pacing the length of the bedroom like a caged panther. "David Chen is trying to block the power of attorney. He's filed a motion for a formal competency hearing, citing potential fiduciary irregularities. And he's gotten a court order for a full independent audit of all our household and personal accounts for the last 2 years. He's digging, Leo. He's looking at the Milan trip, the spa weekends, the 50 grand for my friend. Everything." Earl lay still, a monument of patience savoring her panic. The word irregularities was a beautiful, sterile, legalistic term for what she had done. It was the language of his world, the world of contracts and consequences, and it was being turned on her like a weapon. A day later, another call, this one to her lawyer. What do you mean he got an injunction against the Petrocelli sale? On what grounds? Hostile to long-term shareholder interests? It's a cash offer. How can that be hostile? David is poisoning the board against me. Crendler, you have to do something. He's making me look like I'm incompetent or worse. Then came the call that was music to his ears, a symphony of destruction. And that's not even the worst of it, she screamed at Leo, her voice cracking with fury. He somehow got a court order for a DNA sample from Junior. He claimed the company's executive life insurance policy, the one that pays out millions, required genetic confirmation for all listed heirs in the event of incapacitation. It was a lie, a complete fabrication. But the judge bought it. Junior said some woman in a lab coat just showed up at his dorm, said it was routine for the university's health services, and swabbed his cheek. How could he be so stupid? The pieces were moving into place on the board. The DNA test, the financial audit, the legal roadblocks. David was not just a bulldog. He was a grandmaster, and he was playing a game of chess that Monica didn't even know had begun. She thought she was playing checkers, and she had just been put in checkmate from across the room. The final piece of the plan was the house itself, his beautiful house. It was tainted, corrupted beyond saving. It had to be scoured from his life. On another call, David informed a suspicious but intrigued Monica that a potential buyer had made an unsolicited, all-cash offer on the property, nearly 30% above its already formidable market value. An offer so good, it would be fiduciary malpractice for the estate to refuse it. It's some anonymous shell corporation out of Singapore, Monica explained to Leo, her voice a strange mix of suspicion and avarice. They want to close in 3 days. It's insane. But the money. God, Leo, the money is incredible. David is insisting we take it. Says it's in Earl's best interest to liquidate the asset at its peak value. He's boxing me in with Earl's own cold-blooded logic. I have to agree to the sale, but it doesn't matter. I'll make sure the funds are transferred into an account that only I control the second that POA is signed. Earl almost smiled. The shell corporation was his, of course, funded from a hidden, untouchable trust he'd established decades ago for just such a rainy day. He was buying his own house, just for the satisfaction of taking it away from her. The day of his 63rd birthday arrived. It was a gray, overcast afternoon, the sky the color of unpolished slate. The house was filled with a funereal quiet, the staff having been given the day off. The long mahogany dining table, polished to a mirror shine, was set not for a celebration, but for a grim execution. At the head of the table, in his custom-made high-tech wheelchair, sat Earl. He was dressed in his finest Savile Row suit, a final galling indignity orchestrated by Monica to present an image of respect for the man whose life she was about to formally seize. Present were Monica, looking stunning and predatory in a severe black dress. Leo, posing as her personal support, stood awkwardly by the grand limestone fireplace, trying to look as if he belonged amongst the wealth he was about to steal. Junior was there, pale and fidgety, his eyes red-rimmed, refusing to look at the silent figure in the wheelchair. And at the far end of the table sat 2 sets of lawyers. Monica Shark, Crendler, with a smug look on his face, and David Chin, accompanied by Earl's old trusted estate lawyer, a quiet, brilliant man named Robert Henderson, whom Monica thought she had summarily fired. Thank you all for coming on this difficult day, Monica began, her voice trembling with perfectly practiced emotion. She placed a hand on Earl's shoulder, a gesture of proprietary affection. As you know, Earl would have wanted his affairs to be in order. He was always a man of foresight. This power of attorney is merely a formality to ensure that I, as his loving wife, can continue to manage his estate and his care as he would have wished. She placed the thick vellum document on the portable tray attached to Earl's wheelchair. She uncapped a heavy Mont Blanc fountain pen, his own pen, its familiar weight feeling alien and powerful in her hand. "Now, Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice turning sharp as she addressed Earl's lawyer. "Your presence is noted, but frankly, it's unnecessary. My legal counsel has assured me this is all perfectly straightforward." Henderson adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses. "I am here at the behest of Mr. Chan, representing the interests of the board, to witness the execution of this document and ensure all protocols are followed." Monica's eyes flashed with annoyance, but she held her composure. This was the final hurdle. She took Earl's limp right hand. It felt like a piece of cold clay in her grasp, unresponsive and heavy. "It's okay, my love," she cooed, for the benefit of the lawyers. "Just a little signature. I'll help you." She wrapped her manicured fingers around his, positioning the pen over the signature line. She began to guide his hand, the scratch of the nib on the expensive paper sounding unnaturally loud in the tense, silent room. The first stroke of the A in Arthur was almost complete. And then it happened. The dead hand came to life. Earl's fingers, which had been limp and useless for weeks, snapped shut around her wrist. It wasn't a feeble twitch or a muscle spasm. It was a grip of pure, compressed steel, the grip of a man who had spent his youth hauling rebar and framing houses in the blistering sun. Monica gasped, a strangled yelp of shock and raw pain. She tried to pull away, but his hand was an iron manacle. Her eyes, wide with a terror that was finally, completely genuine, flew to his face. The vacant stare was gone. His eyes, clear and blazing with a cold, intelligent fire, were locked directly on hers. He saw not the woman he had loved, but a parasite he was about to burn off. Slowly, deliberately, he tightened his grip. A whimper escaped Monica's lips. Leo took a half step forward. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" With a power that seemed to come from the very earth, a power born of weeks of coiled rage and isometric tension, Earl pushed himself up from the wheelchair. The chair rolled backward and hit the wall with a soft thud. The lawyers gasped in unison. Crandler's jaw dropped. Henderson allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Junior stumbled backward, a cry of pure fear catching in his throat as he stared at the ghost that now stood before him. Earl stood, tall and straight, still clutching Monica's wrist, holding her in place. He was no longer a vegetable. He was a titan returned from the dead, an architect of vengeance surveying his masterpiece. The silence in the room was absolute, a vacuum broken only by Monica's panicked, shallow breathing. He let go of her wrist as if dropping a piece of trash. She scrambled away from him, clutching her arm, her face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. Earl reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, his movements fluid and precise. He did not pull out a wallet. He pulled out a small, sleek remote control. He aimed it at a Bose speaker concealed within a large floral arrangement in the center of the table and pressed a button. The room filled with Monica's voice, captured in high-fidelity audio, sharp and cruel, and utterly damning. "Of course not. He thinks Junior is his. He's so pathetic, Leo. He was sterile." The recording played on, an unedited symphony of their betrayal. Every word of their conversation from that night echoed off the polished walls. The mockery of his mind, the confession of his sterility, Leo's smug chuckle, Monica's venomous glee as she called him an old fool and detailed their plans to steal his life's work, the part about Junior getting over the news of the accident when reminded of a new Porsche. When the recording ended, The silence it left behind was heavier and more suffocating than before. Monica was frozen, her beautiful face a grotesque canvas of comprehension. Leo looked like an animal caught in the glare of a semi-truck, his eyes darting toward the door, calculating his chances of escape. Junior was openly weeping now, his body racked with sobs, his hands covering his face in shame. Earl looked at Monica, his expression as hard and unforgiving as the granite on his fireplace. He was an engineer reading a final damning structural analysis report. "You wanted power of attorney," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, rusty from disuse but losing none of its inherent command. "You wanted control of my money." He paused, letting the words hang in the dead air like dust motes in a tomb. "There is no money." Monica stared at him, her mind unable to process the words. What? What are you talking about? The accounts? The sale? While you were playing the grieving wife, Earl continued, his voice as cold as the grave he had just climbed out of. My friend Mr. Chen was very busy. As of 9 a.m. yesterday, every single one of my liquid assets, including the proceeds from the recent sale of this house, was transferred to a series of untraceable, encrypted offshore trusts. The joint accounts we shared have been frozen, pending a federal fraud investigation that Mr. Henderson will be initiating on my behalf Monday morning. Your personal credit cards, which were linked to those accounts, were all canceled approximately 2 hours ago. He gestured with a sweep of his hand to the magnificent room around them. As for this house, you are currently trespassing. It was sold 3 days ago. The new owners have been very accommodating in allowing us to have this final family dinner. Their security team will be taking possession of the property in precisely 1 hour. I suggest you don't be here when they arrive. Monica's mouth opened and closed, a fish gasping for air. Her entire world, the future she had been so sure of, was dissolving into smoke before her eyes. Earl reached for the power of attorney document on the tray of his now discarded wheelchair. He picked it up, not to sign it, but to reveal what lay beneath it. It was another document, a single clinical sheet of paper. He slid it across the polished table toward Monica. It glided silently and came to a stop directly in front of her. You wanted my signature, he said, his voice dropping even lower. Instead, I believe this belongs to you. She looked down, her eyes struggling to focus through her tears. It was a lab report, a certified DNA analysis. At the top, in stark black letters, were the names Arthur Earl and Arthur Jr. Wallace. Wallace, Leo's surname. At the bottom of the page, a single brutal conclusion was highlighted in garish yellow. Probability of paternity, 0.0%. The finality of it, the cold scientific proof of her life's ultimate lie, finally broke her. A terrible guttural sob ripped from her throat, a sound of absolute ruin. Earl looked past her, his gaze falling upon the boy cowering by the wall, the boy he had loved more than his own life. There was no anger left for him, only a vast, empty chasm of pity. You are not my son, he said, the words simple, factual, and utterly devastating. I have no son. He then turned his attention back to Monica and to Leo, who was now inching his way along the wall toward the exit. Get out, Earl said. It was not a shout. It was a command, delivered with the absolute authority of a man who had built cities and could just as easily destroy a life. Get out of my house. They stared at him, paralyzed by the sheer breathtaking totality of their defeat. Now, he added, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that promised consequences far worse than shouting ever could. That broke the spell. Monica, stumbling like a drunkard, sobbing hysterically, grabbed Leo's arm. They practically ran from the room, a graceless, panicked scramble. Their footsteps echoed in the grand foyer, followed by the percussive slam of the heavy oak front door. Junior, after a moment of agonized hesitation, a final pleading look at the man who was no longer his father, fled after them into the gray, unforgiving twilight. Crendler, Monica's lawyer, looking pale and profoundly shaken, gathered his briefcase with trembling hands and departed without a word, eager to distance himself from the blast radius. Now, only Earl, David, and Henderson remained in the cavernous dining room, the silence punctuated by the faint scent of expensive perfume and shattered dreams. David Chen walked to the head of the table and placed a firm, steady hand on his friend's shoulder. "Are you all right, Arthur?" he asked quietly. Earl looked around the room, at the ghosts of 1,000 phantom memories, the laughter, the celebrations, the life he thought he had so masterfully built. It had all been an illusion, a beautifully constructed lie. He had lost his wife, his son, his home, his future. By any rational measure, he had lost everything he held dear. The pain of it was a dull, heavy ache beneath the cold satisfaction of his victory. But as he stood there, solid and unbending in the ruins of his own life, he realized he had reclaimed the one thing they couldn't take, the one thing he had almost given away, the foundation, himself. "Yes, David," Earl said, his voice firm and clear as he met his friend's gaze. "For the first time in a very long time, I believe I am." He took a deep breath, the first truly free breath he had taken in weeks. The air was empty, clean. It was the smell of a cleared demolition site, ready for something new to be built.